The date is October 8th, 2018. I am Hansen Sue, curator at the Center for Software History here at the Computer History Museum, and I'm here with Steve Naroff. Welcome.
Great to be here.
So, starting out, where and when were you born?
So I was actually born in March of 1961 in Poughkeepsie, New York. My parents were there briefly. Soon after I was born, we actually moved to the Bronx in New York, where I spent the first 6-7 years of life.
Oh, wow. And what's your family's background ethnically?
So my dad's side of the family, his dad migrated from Odessa, Russia. So there's, on my dad's side, Russian descent, and on my mom's side, Hungary, Austria. So, and I guess in terms of sort of our heritage, we consider ourselves Ashkenazi Jews.
Okay.
So.
And what did your parents do?
My dad was a professional musician and then educator. He toured with the Navy Band for 4 years during the Korean War, and then after that received a master's degree from Manhattan School of Music, and plays tenor sax, mainly jazz, but is also a fabulous conductor, and has written a book on jazz improvisation in the 80s that was used by many universities. So he's just a heavyweight in the jazz community, and is 85 and still plays with groups. Wow. in Florida. So it's pretty amazing. And he was my music teacher. So I started playing the clarinet at a young age, and did a lot of work with him on music.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, which became influential later on, yeah. And your mother stayed at home, or?
She was a homemaker. She also did some miscellaneous administrative jobs for companies in the area. She was always busy. But my father was the main breadwinner, so to speak, in the family. And he also had a big private following of students. So he taught at school during the day, and then at night he had kids coming to the house for private lessons quite often.
Was your family religious?
Not really. We had very religious grandparents and great-grandparents because they were more first generation. And I was bar mitzvahed when I was 13, basically to make the grandparents happy. But religion wasn't a big part of my life. You know, we would do some of the holidays and observe traditions, but overall I wouldn't consider ourselves religious. But learning enough Hebrew to actually do the bar mitzvah was definitely stressful. It was a Reformed temple. It's interesting, the area we grew up is now inhabited by very religious Jews, Hasidic Jews, that work in New York City. The town we actually settled in was a place called Spring Valley, which is a very nice suburb about 30 miles outside New York City, and it's quite a religious area now.
Wow. What was the community like, that area that you grew up in?
Well, it was, when compared with the Bronx, where we were in an apartment living, we were like very close to the subway. The whole apartment would shake when it would drive by. It was very quiet, very suburban, big lot, certainly by California standards. I think we had like an acre of land, and I would work on the land with my dad, and big pool, just a beautiful suburb, and the schools were exceptional there, which was one of the reasons my dad moved us away from the city and out to the suburbs, which was very common in the day. And for us, it wasn't just about him wanting better schools for his kids, but it was him wanting a better place to work as an educator. That the schools in New York were rough. My dad actually, I guess I should go back and mention, he grew up on East 105th Street, which is Harlem in New York. He grew up in a very tough part of New York, And music, aside from him being drawn to it and loving it, music was a way out of the tough projects, and also a way to get respect from all the people there. So, because it was a really rough place.
Right, yeah. Wow. Do you have any siblings?
Sister, Debbie, she still lives in Ramsey, New Jersey, which is close to where we grew up. And her husband, she actually went to the same school as I did, and she met her husband there like I met my wife there. So we both attended Oswego, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, and we both met our spouses there.
Oh, wow. Any formative experiences as a child?
Well, because a clarinet was put in my mouth at the age of 6, and my father was, somewhat of a disciplinarian when it came to music and education. Most of it centered around music, but I played baseball. I was a pitcher, did other things. But but most of it was music, and early on, most of it was classical music. So by the time I was in 9th grade, I was playing the Mozart Clarinet Concerto, which was considered one of the more difficult pieces for the instrument, being graded annually at the New York NISMA. Would judge you and write up all kinds of critique on your playing. And so, by ninth grade, I was a pretty established classical clarinetist.
Wow.
Yeah, and around transitioning from 9th to 10th grade, I decided that classical music wasn't really my calling. It was very highly structured, and it didn't provide that much freedom that I was looking for, so I switched over to tenor sax and gravitated much more to jazz, and that carried on for the rest of my college. I pretty much stopped playing clarinet and just focused on sax and jazz, and something I enjoyed more. But clarinet was a great predecessor to the sax. They're very similar instruments.
Right, yeah. What kinds of books did you read?
Because the music was at such a young age, I was listening and reading music and just everything music. And when it came to reading, I read the stuff that the teachers required in school. But when I was, looking to just unwind, it was much more around music. And even, even magazines, at the time, Mad Magazine was like a huge thing growing up, or National Lampoon. So when it came to just having fun, it was music and magazines, and not so much reading serious literature, which is interesting because my daughter actually at a very young age, I remember, picked up Lord of the Rings and read it all.
Wow.
And like, wow, where'd that come from? And even my daughter actually had an affinity for the Merck medical manual and would read that also. Yeah. It's like once my daughter was in a bookstore with my grandparents, and I remember them asking, well, what books do you want us to buy? And she said the Merck medical manual. And yeah, so there's reading somewhere in there, but as far as I go, it was heavily tilted towards music. And when I got to college, and fell in love with computers, it was a different story. I was reading everything I could about computers, and in those days, as we'll talk about, it's actually hard to find the books. Right. We actually had to go into New York City and into some really obscure places. It wasn't like going on Amazon and searching for stuff. So.
Right. But that was primarily nonfiction about computers, not like science fiction or anything?
Exactly. I mean, I was into science fiction, TV. I was a big Star Trek fan back in the day. So I tended to watch series or Twilight Zone, into that type of stuff, but not so much reading, more of a visual person.
Right, yeah. What Talk about education at school.
Now, where do you want me to start? Like what?
Like K through 12, high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I was a good student. I was always meticulous in my notes. In fact, I actually brought some notes from my compiler class we could browse later from college. I was always a meticulous note taker. And school came pretty easy to me. I wasn't ultra competitive when it came to school. And regarding SATs later on and tests, I was not a huge believer in that type of testing, but I did well enough to get around and to do what I needed to do. In high school, I did well in math, but it wasn't being taught in a way that excited me about, well, what could you do with this stuff? It's like, okay, I'm doing well at it, but what does this mean? So I didn't really bind with it, which is why I kept on getting back to music. But math and music have interesting relationships. And so I think maybe the music background made it easier for me to grok some of the math. The school was in Spring Valley at the time. I don't know what it's like now, but at the time was very highly rated, very well supported by the community, and very diverse, a very diverse group. In that area, unlike this area, when I say diverse, we didn't have a lot of Indian and Asian people in that area, but whatever people we had, it was diverse. Had a lot of African American folks. It wasn't just rich white folk in the school. It was a broad spectrum, which I actually feel is great. I think that learning how to interact in a public school setting, assuming the public school is a good school, is the best thing. And I've tried to keep my kids as much as possible in public schools. In high school, we end up deviating from that and sent them away to a boarding school, but that was later on in life. But as far as my schooling, it was fairly uneventful. I'd say the one thing that's worth noting is my dad taught in the same school, high school and junior high school I went to. Oh. So he was my music director. And that was challenging because he's a disciplinarian. He was the head of the orchestra, the conductor, and really kept people in line. And at that age, kids didn't understand discipline as much. I mean, some kids did. So I always felt like kids, if they got yelled at in orchestra, after orchestra, they'd look at me like, man, your dad's, grumpy. So it was mixed. And my dad also, because he was there, was able to keep an eye on me. And if I was out of line and another teacher talked to him, it wasn't a fun experience after school. But we didn't have that many of those instances. I was a pretty straight ahead kid and did what I was supposed to, not very rebellious, minor stuff surrounding music, but not too bad.
Good. Did you have any mentors, favorite teachers, heroes growing up?
Most of my mentors, and I don't know if heroes is the right word, but people I respected were professional musicians who I was going to see in Greenwich Village, in jazz clubs like Sonny Rollins or Michael Brecker, who were the saxophone players of the day. I really looked up to them because I was a talented musician, but I didn't have the dexterity or the work ethic that some of these other people that attain stardom do. Most of them work 5-6 hours a day on their instrument. And I had natural talent, and I might play 1 or 2 hours a day. And I understood the difficulty in getting to where they were and making it look as easy as they made it look. So I had a lot of respect for musicians. But in terms of academics in the day, I ended up having most of my computer science mentors, because of the year, because I graduated high school in '79, computers were really in their infancy as far as, there were mainframe computers, but certainly people like Steve Jobs and others weren't around to be revered at that point. But in college, we'll talk later. I mean, there's lots of interesting people I ended up having a lot of respect for, and considering them mentors, even if I didn't know them. In college, I felt Alan Kay was a mentor just from reading what he was writing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue to talk about where was your first exposure to computers?
It was college. When we were deciding what I was going to do after high school, and for a while I thought I just wanted to go music, just become a musician. My dad sat me down and talked some sense into me, and even though he was, a big supporter of my music, since he had toured the world and knows what it's like to do music as a career, he suggested that I minor in music, continue doing my music, but consider another major. And the major that we casually talked about at the time was computer science. Because computer science, undergraduate computer science curriculums were not even that common in the day. In fact, I did a little research to lead up to this interview, and I didn't realize it, but the computer science curriculum at Oswego, where I ended up, was founded in 1970 by OOPSLA van Dijk, who was a Danish mathematician who found his way to Oswego, and in '68 wrote a proposal for having a computer science curriculum. And I guess Potsdam was the only other state university of New York that was considering computer science undergrad, basically Bachelor of Arts degrees in computer science. And there were 60 other SUNY schools with bigger names like Stony Brook and Albany and Binghamton, bigger hubs, and they didn't have computer science curriculums at the time. So I guess another note on this as well is, when I was doing research, I wondered, well, when did Stanford University start an undergraduate program? And I was actually shocked that Stanford did not have an undergraduate curriculum for computer science until 1986.
Wow.
They had graduate programs, but no undergrad. So I didn't realize it at the time, but it wasn't an easy domain to find schools to educate you in. So yeah,
So is that why you went to SUNY Oswego, because they had a computer science program, undergrad?
Well, I wound up at Oswego for several reasons. Number one, it's worth noting that because my dad was a school teacher, and because we had to consider the reality of what it would cost, and we were fairly conservative people and didn't want to take out massive loans, we pretty much said, the SUNY schools in New York State were fabulous at the time. Why not just limit our search to SUNY, which we did. And then once I started looking at the SUNY schools, Potsdam and Oswego were the only places with computer science programs of the day. And they also were receptive to me being a music minor. See, that's the other trick. The interesting thing is when a school adds a degree program like that, sometimes they don't want you to minor in something that's, as demanding as music.
Right.
So they just don't want you to be distracted. So Oswego from the get-go was like, yeah, we'd love to have you play in our orchestra and jazz band as a minor and major in computer science. And Potsdam was not quite as receptive to that. So I think we decided on Oswego for that reason. It was also on Lake Ontario, which was just beautiful. The only downside in terms of locale with Oswego is it was really cold, really cold. Like so cold and so windy that if you were under a certain weight, you could not walk outside near the lake for fear of being blown in to the lake. So yeah, it was, I think they have tunnels now, or some of the schools have tunnels. But in the summer, it's just a gorgeous place. So just to recap, it was, a good value. I think at the time it was roughly $6,000 a year. Now it's $27,000 if you include room and board, which you have to include because no one lives near Oswego. And I had a modest loan. I think I had a $3,000 school loan, which was paid off pretty quickly. So that was the reason. And as we'll talk. It ended up being, I guess do you want to hear a little bit more about Oswego?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it ended up being a perfect place for me because a fellow named Craig Gracie, who was my mentor there and taught me most of my computer courses, had a master's in math, and he had decided to start teaching computer science in 1978, which was the year before I showed up. And so he was learning about compilers and operating systems and all these great things at the same time we were. And he was a great teacher, but it makes you even greater when you're learning it along with the kids. And he was just an amazing person, was a big part of my life there, also very into music. So we were a kinship there as well, and just took a lot of personal interest in me, which, considering I wasn't a crazy great student in the sense that I was never really pushed hard in high school. I just sort of naturally got by and did well and had pretty good grades. But in college, even a college like Oswego, where you're studying compilers and operating systems, it was really challenging. It was not easy. And having him take a personal interest in me made all the difference. Another person that came about 2 years after I showed up, I think around 1980, was Doug Lee. Doug Lee was also a mentor, and Doug and Craig are still at Oswego, and Doug's a very prolific author. He's written books on Java, concurrency, C++. He's like a luminary in both the C++ and Java communities. And both those guys just love teaching. They never felt any need to get into industry, because when I got into industry, I called Craig and I said, there's so many cool things to do in industry. Are you interested in getting out of academia? But had no interest in it, just purely, and he's the director of their cognitive studies there now. And it ended up being a great place. I mean, I actually when I left Oswego, even though we did all our work in punch cards, I printed my compiler and still have it to this day. And it's something I'm really proud of. It was done in Pascal.
So the first program you wrote was part of one of your classes?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't remember what that program is or was. I mean, obviously we all do Hello World in whatever language we're learning. I do know my first course was in Fortran. Fortran was the language that was supported on the IBM 1130, which was a big mainframe. And I'm sure they were just probably basic sorts or whatever you do in Fortran. Fortran, I think I only took one or two courses where that was the language. I programmed in lots of other languages. We programmed, I think, my second year in a language called GPSS, General Purpose Simulation System. It's a statistical queuing theory and, sort of Joe's barbershop type of problems. And that was an interesting course. And then most of my courses were in Pascal.
Right.
Yeah.
And mostly on mainframes as well, punch cards, you mentioned?
Exclusively. The IBM 1130 had punch cards. We would, do assemblers and compilers with decks that were like this big, sometimes multiple decks. And you had 3 runs a day to get your program right. And that required a lot of discipline. I mean, we used to flowchart everything and used to really think about our problems before giving it to the computer. And it's interesting. I don't want to sound like an old codger, but even though interactive development environments like the ones we ended up developing at Apple and Next and so on are wonderful, there's also something wonderful about thinking about your problem that much and having that level of respect for the computer, right? And it took a lot of discipline to get a compiler, a big piece of code, thousands of lines, to work, under that constraint. So yeah, it was time sharing. Later on, the Burroughs 5600, I think, they added a Burroughs computer, but it was all the work was on those 2 mainframes.
And did you first discover object-oriented programming while you were at college?
No.
Oh, wow.
No, the closest thing that I remember in college is talking about Simula to Craig. And I asked whether he was going to end up teaching a course in Simula, and he said, no, not yet. But there was definitely respect for Simula that was being done in Europe. But no, we didn't do anything with it. And to be honest, most of those days were spent thinking of modular programming, not using go-tos and stuff like that, and programming in the large and the benefits of programming in the large that are where objects start reaping benefits. That wasn't really a focus so much. In fact, even in my first job, which we'll get into, objects weren't a part of their methodology, and frankly, it took a while for objects to start catching on.
Right. But you were doing structured programming and modular programming.
Very structured, very modular. I considered, the programs I wrote to be art, and took great pride in even indentation, which again is sort of odd because you're never really looking at it, right? But when you printed it, you had to look at it. So, it was really important to just manage complexity, and certainly indentation, making sure you didn't have routines that were unwieldy, were all part of trying to manage the complexity, which without managing the complexity, you wouldn't be able to get complex program to run in 3 runs a day. So a lot, I can't sit here and actually say the art, that I was doing the art for art's sake. It was more a side effect of how do you really make something a puzzle that's this complex work under these constraints. And so that's part of the reason, I guess, I feel it's that part of the rigor and art is missing today and encourages a lot of sloppy work, sloppy programming.
Did you have any summer jobs or internships?
So in my before my junior year, I did odd jobs like cook at Nathan's, which was a hot dog place in New York. But my junior year, I decided to apply for an internship at IBM, and I got that job as a computer operator. And that job was basically babysitting these really expensive, high-speed laser printers, keeping them fed with paper and data. And these laser printers were just a spectacle. I mean, you couldn't even see the paper fly by. And this was in basically around 1980, 1981. probably. Yeah.
I think one of the documents you showed me said 1982. Is that
82.
correct?
Okay,
82?
there we go. Great. So yeah, I did that internship with IBM. It was local. It was in a place called Franklin Lakes, New Jersey. And Franklin Lakes ended up being across the street from my first real job out of school. It's just kind of interesting how that worked out, because that part of New Jersey was not a hub of technology. But, you know, there were some interesting places to work. And so, yeah, the job paid well. I think back in the day, I was being paid $14 an hour, if I recall, which, for, you know, if you do the math, it's probably like $30, $40 an hour by today's standards. And it was just, I didn't learn much, but I got to see the monstrosities that that basically print lots of stuff. It's hopefully there's a lot less printing that goes on today. I would imagine there is, because we have such great storage capabilities. But yeah, that was a great internship.
So let's get to your first job. So you graduated in 1983.
Graduated in '83, and you know, we didn't have LinkedIn in those days. I forget how I arrived at the two job interviews I ended up taking. Well, I remember one, and the other one, opportunity I didn't take. I flew from where I grew up, New York, to Pomona, California, to take an interview with General Dynamics. I totally forget how I found them or they found me. Chances are they found me because I wasn't looking for them. and so they said, hey, we want to talk to you. So I flew out. I had no idea what I'd be working on. And I flew out, and I'm sitting in the waiting room, and they give me like these brochures on the products that I'd be working on, and they were missiles that I'd be working on Fortran code for their computer-aided missile program. And, you know, right then, I guess I should have realized that may be the case, but that was culture shock to me. I really didn't want to work on, you know, war instruments. So I took the interview. I have no recollection of it, but just sort of tuned it out. But it was good experience to do. It was my first job interview, you know, so it was good experience. It was also, I think, the first time I was ever on a plane. My kids grew up in a different world, and they've been flying since they're like little kids. But yeah, I had no opportunities to go on a plane, so that was a little stressful, I guess, at the time. I'm flying by myself too. But the other job, I do remember what happened. My mother actually said, you know, her friend Rosalie down the road works at a cool little company called Henckels, Haas Brown. And I said, okay. And she contacted Rosalie and said, my son's graduating with a computer science degree. Would you be interested in talking to him? And I got her a resume, and they called me down. And they were, I don't know, maybe 10 miles from where I grew up, so very close. And probably within 2 or 3 miles of my internship at IBM. And ended up loving the place, great place. They were actually a company founded by 3 MIT graduates, Lutz Henckels, Ken Brown, and Renee Haas. And they were pioneers in the circuit simulation, test simulation business. They had written some really interesting software that they ended up calling CADAT, Computer-Aided Design and Test. And like a lot of startups, as hardware folks, they, along with some early employees, built a product. And like many startups, realized they needed to then re-engineer parts of it, extend parts of it. They were growing out the customer base. There was lots of stuff to do. And so they hired a pretty nice crop of young folks out of college. I'd say between 5 and 10 of us started the same time. I'm still friends with a lot of the folks. Columbia graduates, Columbia University graduates, Carnegie Mellon, MIT. I was probably from the lesser named schools. But it all worked out great. Learned a lot. It was a great culture. The two things I remember working on there was they had a binary circuit file, which was they had a language for describing how the circuits were connected, and that would compile into a binary file. And they didn't have great tools for looking at the binary files or analyzing them. So I worked on that. And later on, when sockets were added to Unix, actually that's important to note, they were a Unix and a VMS shop, pretty much. When sockets were added, I worked on some software to distribute across different machines, run passes of circuit simulation to speed up the process. And that was kind of bleeding edge at the time because sockets were brand new. The whole notion of using the network and other computers on the network to speed up circuit simulation was considered pretty cool. So that was a fun project.
So was that your first introduction to the Unix world?
It was. First introduction to Unix. And
Writing a lot of C.
And C.
Yeah.
And it was demanding. I mean, that job was demanding mainly to bootstrap my knowledge of all those things. The work itself seemed, once you had the tools under your belt, whether it be the C shell or learning Make or any of these tools, there's just so many tools you had to master to get your job done. But once that learning curve was over, it seemed a lot easier. And I forget how long it took. Probably took, I'd say, 3 to 6 months to feel comfortable. I was there for a couple years. But once I felt comfortable, life was pretty good, and it was a fun place to be. The management was very cool. It was a great culture. Just a great first job. C was tricky. I mean, I should note that I was a little bit surprised coming from Pascal, which encouraged safety, to be working in a language like C that was kind of neutral or encouraged bad things. I won't say encourage bad things, but it was very terse, right? It was easy to make mistakes, very easy to make mistakes. And that's one of the reasons I ended up thinking about, that's when I first started thinking about, isn't there a better way? Like, C's cool, but fundamentally it was developed to aid operating system development. In this case, Unix. They were sort of developed side by side. And for what we were doing, building large simulation tools, it wasn't a real natural fit. So, but, you know, it is what it is. And you know, it ended up working out for that company, and I don't think they ever moved to a higher level language.
So you said you were there for 2 years. When did you move to your second job?
So when I started getting impatient with C and with the tools, I had read some of Alan Kay's work on Smalltalk. There was a Scientific American article that was very famous that I found called Microcomputers and the Personal I forget exactly the title, but it was in 1977, a Scientific American issue, and that was almost life-changing. He talked about Smalltalk, he talked about Dynabook, and which is basically iPads back in the late 70s, and that really expanded my thinking. So I started trying to talk up objects and better programming tools and languages to the principals at it was called HHB Softron at the time. They changed their name. And they had basically told me, listen, we agree with you. Some of this stuff is interesting, but we're running a business and we don't have the time or wherewithal to retool everything. So we'd love if you could stay, but we also understand if you want to go. So I think at the time, job transitions were pretty much guided by headhunters. Okay, so I believe I sought out a headhunter and said, "Here's what I'm interested in. Find me some companies that fit the bill." And I really don't remember whether it was the headhunter that found Saracore in Salt Lake City, or I found them and then said, "Can you pursue them for me?" Don't really remember that detail, but bottom line is I found Saracore, Salt Lake City, Utah, and I just remember being really impressed with what they were doing, because they, unlike HHB, where you had a text file that would plug together all the components, they were doing it all on a screen with graphics. Okay, so think of it as just as Apple helped everyone make the leap to a windowing system, they were doing this in the computer-aided design area. And their principles were taught at Evans and Sutherland and University of Utah, which was a hotbed of this type of work. So, even though Salt Lake City, Utah was like the furthest thing from, a place I really wanted to be growing up in New York, I mean, it's really culture shock. I decided to talk to my wife. We weren't married at the time, but we were planning on getting married. And I said, how about we get married and then move out to Salt Lake City? And that's what we did. And Saracore ended up being a great place. I mean, how much do you want to know about it?
I want to ask more about Cericor, but let's actually, you mentioned wife. Could you talk about talk about meeting her.
So I met Nancy Allen at the time at Oswego. Nancy was a violinist in the orchestra, and I was playing the Mozart clarinet concerto, my greatest hit, a solo with the orchestra. And through the orchestra and through, I think we were in music theory class together, we had gotten to know each other and fell in love and decided she actually was a couple years ahead of me. So she graduated 2 years ahead of me and then took a job at CBS Records and worked in the legal department, interfaced between the legal folks and many of the artists, classical artists.
In New York City?
In New York City. Black Rock. So that too was cool because we got tickets to all kinds of great shows. We got to know, in fact, just recently, Choliang Lin, who's a very famous violinist, he was playing at a place my son was playing, and we got to meet him, and he knew her from those days. So it was like a reunion, and it was really exciting. And Harry Connick, too, is a big star now. Harry Connick he was a young gun at the time, and we got to know him. And so we got to see Earth, Wind, and Fire, Madison Square Garden. Nancy would bring home stacks of albums for free, to get all this music. So I'm like, it was great. We were both really into it. And so when I talked to Nancy about going to Salt Lake City, Utah, I remember her being very supportive. I think once we got there, she had more reservations because at that point in time, in that heavily Mormon culture, females were very much second-class citizens, and we were still young. And she had a hard time going from a great gig in New York to finding a great gig in Salt Lake. She did find a gig, but it wasn't great. And women at the time were not treated the way women were treated in New York, let's just say that.
Right. Politically speaking, so it seems like you come from a fairly liberal background.
Very liberal, very working class, very, democratic, overall liberal. it's not. I sort of hate that there's such a division, especially today. There are certainly some good ideas from the other side, but in today's politics, it's so tribal that, back in the day, though, I didn't pay any attention to politics. One of the unfortunate things, I guess, about getting older is you focus more on that stuff, and it's pretty annoying in today's world. So yeah, but in those days, we were liberal and believed in helping people fundamentally, and believed. We grew up in New York, and at the time there was still a lot of people who didn't have enough. So yeah, paying taxes and assuming the taxes are going to the right place and helping the needy, that was all part of it. And my dad, grew up really poor. I mean, his dad was a cab driver in New York. Started the first dog walking business in New York. Unfortunately, died young from smoking, but they were very poor. So we have sympathy for people who have less, and when I look at everything we're talking about, I know that I'm standing on the shoulders of great people, and we'll talk about some of those later. But I also know that the time that I was born and the time I entered the computer science business was opportune. So.
And earlier you mentioned reading that Scientific American article from Alan Kay. How did you discover Alan Kay's work? Was it just by chance?
I think it was just interacting with the great people at the time. I think it was HHB. I think we just talk about what was going on in the industry, and people shared articles. Yeah, because no social media, certainly. No, let's Google it. Like here, it's easy. I found it online really easily. So it was just word of mouth. When Byte magazine was also very popular in the 70s and 80s, it was also, could be, again, I don't remember exactly, could be reading, let's say, the Smalltalk edition of Byte, and then reading names and then searching out other things that those people had written or believed in. So, Alan was, really well published. And I actually didn't realize it. Well, I didn't know it years ago, but now I was reminded when I was doing some research for this interview that Alan graduated from the University of Utah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, University of Utah is sort of an important place in computing, and
Yeah. So, did you actually ever visit there after you moved out there? Did you ever have any contact with people?
Well, I went out to interview, obviously, with the folks from Saracore, and had a great interview. And it was kind of interesting. The person who I was reporting to was a Mormon, and he was very open about the culture. And I don't remember the exact words, but was telling me that one of their attractions to me was not just some of the relevant experience or my passion for programming, or the fact that I thought MAINSAIL sounded like a cool language to learn and work in. But he said something very unusual. He said, one of the reasons we're interested in you is your leadership skills that are not only sort of something we believe you have, but sort of a cultural thing. It's like you're from New York. There's something about being a Jew from New York that they were attracted to. There's this whole weird Zionist thing that goes on in the Mormon thing. So I almost felt like there was some odd religious connection because of my heritage and where I came from. And listen, whatever, But he had said something to me like, a lot of the Mormon folks that work here are worker bees, and they're happy with that. So realize that you're coming into a culture where you will be expected to lead, and the people working for you want that. Right. Which was very different from Next, which we're going to talk about later, but I had no problem with that. And the group I led was great, high morale, had a great time. It was probably the easiest management leadership gig I've ever had because it was so receptive to that. Because a lot of Silicon Valley workplaces are like herding cats, right? It's like, everyone's running around, has ideas, right? And wants to lead. So, but Salt Lake was different. But it was, so yeah, we worked in MAINSAIL.
That was your first management position?
Formally, it was leadership. Okay. But I think, I don't remember writing reviews, but I was giving people their work and doing combination of design and just project management and a lot of coding, right, too. And
so you weren't formally a manager, but you were.
They called you a team lead.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I was. Maybe I was. What's interesting? What's interesting about doing the little research I did for the interview is, if you would have asked me before I look back in time how long I was there, I would have told you probably 2 or 3 years. I was only there for 1.5 years. And when I arrived, only 5 to 6 months, it wasn't quite 6 months, 5 to 6 months after I arrived, Hewlett-Packard decided to buy the company. And that was also, I would have guessed that was a year, but no, like really soon after, the company was acquired. And it changed, obviously. And I had made a decision to stay under HP ownership for another year. But yeah, MAINSAIL influenced me big time because they were so focused on trying to solve programs, large programs. And they were funded initially by the Stanford biology department because the Stanford biology department knew they were going to have a lot of needs to write larger systems, and I don't think they wanted to do it in C. So a lot of that funding ended up benefiting the KCAD industry because they were floundering, I think, with C. They needed something better. C++ wasn't out yet. But the features that were critical in MAINSAIL that made it so portable were, well, first of all, it wasn't just a language. It was a runtime, an environment, and it wasn't really object-oriented. It was more object-based. It was more module-oriented. I guess it was more like Simula and Modula and Algol. So it wasn't like a lot of object purists would look at it and say, oh, this isn't interesting from an object-oriented perspective, and they might be right. But it was interesting for many other reasons. And it was one of these really pragmatic languages where they said you shouldn't have to link. There was no link step like C. Everything was dynamically loaded. You would load a module. As modules required other modules, they would be loaded. All the modules were self-describing. They all had metadata. That metadata was used for garbage collection and other. So it had garbage collection built in, yet was very pragmatic with collection. It actually allowed you to do things that a lot of other languages didn't allow you to do, like get a direct memory pointer. Each module was tagged by the compiler, whether it was a safe module or an unsafe module. So obviously in any large program, you'd hope that most of your modules were safe, but it didn't stand in the way of doing low-level bit twiddling if you had to. So it's a very pragmatic language, had a coroutine facility, which similar to blocks in other languages. And they did great things with it.
MAINSAIL came from the Stanford AI lab?
So SAIL was developed at the AI lab, and then the biology, I don't know exactly how the connection was made, but the biology department at Stanford then hired the principals at Zydac, which was the company that was formed out of Stanford, to work on a machine-independent version of SAIL.
Okay.
See, people were struggling with all these computers that were coming out. You know, there was so much diversity with workstations. You know, Sun for a while, well, Apollo before Sun, which was a Boston-based company, they were pretty big for a while. They did the Aegis operating system. But then when Unix hit, even Aegis had to offer Unix emulation. And so yeah, with all these workstations out there, companies just wanted to be abstracted from this, and so that they write a program that runs everywhere. So yeah, MAINSAIL was financed by the biology department, and then later they spun the company off, and I don't know how that happened. I don't know any of that history, but it's interesting. They were located on Deer Creek in Palo Alto, right almost beside where Next was. I thought that was a really weird coincidence, right?
So MAINSAIL was a portable version of SAIL, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
That was a stated goal, to develop large portable programs. And it did that really well, even though it never gained wide acceptance.
But it was taken up by, you mentioned CAD companies like Saracore, because it was good for, like, why did Cericor decide to use MAINSAIL? Maybe is the question.
I think the choice was between C and, in their mind, MAINSAIL. That there wasn't any other choice for them. They had found MAINSAIL and liked the idea so much after looking at the feature set, because realize most garbage collected languages, let's say like Smalltalk, were born in a research environment and they weren't pragmatic for real products. So I think that they thought they could influence it. They thought they'd get special attention. They weren't going to be waiting around for C++ to mature, which at the time C++ was being talked about and being researched, but there were no implementations which people felt comfortable with in the early 80s. It was a preprocessor still, not native compiler, and the language was just growing and evolving, and I think they felt like they could work with Zydac. Zydac did give Saracore a lot of personal love and care, which was important, because they were a real company. They wanted to develop real products, and yeah, I think they were happy with their decision, but HP wasn't happy with the decision. So HP came in and started pretty quickly getting fearful of dealing with such a proprietary language with such a proprietary company. And obviously they could have potentially bought it and fed it, but they decided against that, and they started this 5-year-long effort to convert the MAINSAIL code to C++. And I knew from the very beginning that this was not looking like a smart thing for them to do. And 5 years later, they canned it. So they tinkered around for 5 years. I wasn't around at the time, and eventually canned it. And it's one of those naive management engineering decisions that you see far too often. So much wasted time and effort because executives make decisions that make no sense. And they weren't asking for our opinion. I mean, I'm sure I gave it to them, but they didn't care.
Right.
You know, taking an application which was developed with garbage collection from the get-go,
Right.
and going to a system that isn't garbage collected, just that alone is a showstopper.
Yeah.
But then if you consider other showstoppers like no link, okay, dynamically loaded on the fly, C++ wasn't very good at that. Yeah, it was just such a bonehead decision, man. But so, and I don't know when Zydac went out of business, the company that did MAINSAIL. They were just great compiler people. They were another example where they're a great technical startup that other great technical startups admired, I think. Because when I talked to Mentor Graphics, who was big in that area, and even interviewed with them later, they had tremendous respect for MAINSAIL and what we had done at Saracore. They weren't as brave, and their technical people acknowledged that, and they were moving to C++, but they were moving to C++ from C. So it was a much easier transition for them. But Zydac failed like so many startups, especially language startups, where they might have great compiler chops, great insight into runtimes and compilers and linkers, and they did. But the business plan wasn't as well articulated. And let's face it, being in the language business is a tough business. And, I watched your Brad Cox interview, and, Brad was very clear that it was tough being in the tools business in general, but the language business in particular. Yeah.
One last question, I guess, before we move on from Saracore. Saracore, that's Cericor, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Could you talk more about the product that you are working on for Saracore?
Sure. Well, it was a schematic capture package where people would design circuits. They would plop their little NAND gate or whatever their gate is on the screen, and they would wire it up to other components, and then could package those components, and so on and so forth. So it was a graphical development environment for designing circuits and simulating them. And it's so cool. We would do circuit simulation, and you would see the zeros and ones flow through the little wires that were on the screen. Very, very sexy. I mean, very cool product. Unclear if it would scale up to the type of demands that really, really large circuit purveyors have. That's also true for startups, right? I mean, there were a lot of cool features. I don't know whether it was robust enough to support the type of things Intel does. I mean, clearly Intel and other hardware companies have a lot of homegrown tools, some of which I imagine are off the shelf. But ultimately, it's a combination of things. So that was sort of at the glass what the product was. But what I was working on was one of the projects I did involved capturing all the input so that we can do testing of an interactive tool like that. Because with interactive tools, it's usually harder to write regression tests, right? In other words, you want someone to build a circuit and then succeed, and then as you evolve the system, rerun that schematic capture and simulation. So one of the projects I had was to capture all the menu input and mouse input and play it back later. So we called that journaling at the time. So journaling was something I worked on. I also worked on the object-oriented architecture that was built on top of MAINSAIL. As I said, MAINSAIL in and of itself wasn't wildly object-oriented. So they had a system which was designed before I got there, but I also obviously contributed to it when I got there to develop an object-based architecture that was used to develop the product. So for example, we didn't have an interface builder to build the GUI itself, but we did have a language that allowed you to express the UI so that you wouldn't have to write it in bare bones MAINSAIL code. I think we called that the Saracore development language. I don't believe we published it to our clients, but it was used internally. So that's where I got a big taste of actually metadata, designing an architecture on top of a language. And my job was to learn it, then educate all the team members and evolve it so that it had integrity, because there was a lack of knowledge throughout the company, especially when HP came on board, when you started adding more and more engineers about, well, how do I do this? How do I add this or do that? So I led the infrastructure team. I forget what we called ourselves, but there I was a leader, and they wanted to bring me into management, but as I said, I only stayed a year and a half at that company. And it's kind of, I look back at some of this stuff, and it's just amazing how much was packed into some of this time. A lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Things were moving fast
Right.
in the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s.
So clearly you saw the writing on the wall at some point into the HP acquisition of Cericor.
I saw the writing on the wall. In fact, after the acquisition, I took an interview at Mentor Graphics in Oregon. That's where they were based. Mentor was the 2,000-pound gorilla in that space. Very successful company. I think they're still around. They were sold for billions of dollars not so long ago. And they made me an offer. And I decided, rather than leave Saracore after merely 6 months and go to Mentor, to be a little bit more patient. And at that time, I actually made the decision that I wanted to get out of the software tools for hardware people and into software tools for software people, because I was a software person. I pretty much made the decision that, Mentor's in good hands. They don't need me. And, they thought they did. They didn't. And I said, let me continue helping HP, even though I know it's not heading in the right direction. There's still stuff to do. There's fun stuff to learn. I like the people. So I hung out another year, and that year was the birth of OOPSLA. So I went to OOPSLA, the very first one, back to Portland, where it was located, and that was where my idea, that's where opportunity is where luck meets preparation. I was prepared to make that transition, and I met a lot of cool people, including Brad Cox and Tom Love, at that first OOPSLA. And I don't know whether we decided after that brief meeting at OOPSLA to have me in for an interview. I don't remember exactly how it unfolded, but soon after meeting them, I took an interview in Sandy Hook, Connecticut for them. It's interesting to note, before making that connection to Objective-C and to, at the time, PPI, Productivity Products International, I thought I wanted to work at AT&T on C++. Because they were doing really cool stuff. And AT&T, I think Bjorn's lab was like a lot of their research work in Princeton, New Jersey, or near it. And it's a beautiful place. It's a great place, and it's near where I grew up. And so it's like, wow, I could sort of go back to where I grew up. But long story short is, the little bit I pursued them, they basically immediately, I forget whether it was a headhunter or they said directly, but I didn't have a PhD, so we don't need you.
Because it was Bell Labs.
It was Bell
Right.
Labs. It was Bell Labs. Only PhDs need apply. They, which at the time I was actually pretty upset. I wasn't so upset I wanted to go back and get a PhD. but it was a ding, considering everything up till then was, oh yeah, come work for us, and wow, you're doing good work. That was my first kind of rejection, but as with lots of things, things still worked out, right? Because if they would have accepted me, life would have been a lot different, I'm convinced. So fortunately, they rejected me, and I went to PPI, had a pretty good interview, and they made me an offer. And Connecticut wasn't too far from where I grew up, so it was still, I was able to see my parents and feel like I was back on the East Coast, because Salt Lake again was culture shock.
Right.
So that was good, and
Was Nancy able to find a better gig?
She did. Actually, when we were, I forget what the company was called, or maybe she worked for a physics professor. There was some physics lab there. I'm drawing a little bit of a blank on where she worked, but we liked it. We also bought our first house, a condominium. Interest rates were 14%. Imagine that. 14%. Yeah. I guess it encourages the houses to go down in value, right? That's the good news. You pay less for the house, hopefully. But we moved to Connecticut, and Sandy Hook, and the location of PPI was so beautiful. So beautiful. I wish I had more pictures in the day. So that was my transition into working on software tools for software people.
So you said you met Brad and Tom at OOPSLA. What was your first impression of them?
My first impression of Brad was how composed a speaker he was. He was a really composed on panels. I think I saw him on a panel, and very professional, well-spoken. And at the time, most of what he was speaking about was not Objective-C, the language, but the revolution that he saw with evolving to object-oriented. As you know, he wrote a famous book, Object-Oriented, An Evolutionary Approach. And I had picked that up. And, I wasn't as smitten with the book. I thought it was a little bit more marketing than it was technical. But that's not necessarily bad, right? It's clear that he had a knack for selling the vision. And he talked about the Industrial Revolution, and he talked about, soldering ICs together. And there was something compelling about what he was saying at the time. And I don't think I was the only one who felt that. I think his shtick put PPI on the map. Tom was more in the background, right? Tom was more the business guy. Tom was also a very charismatic speaker, but he was typically speaking to business people, not technical people. But Tom and I actually lived in the same condo community and got to know each other quite well. And he's just a fantastic human, and really like Tom. So I liked both of them when I met them, and felt like they seemed, though they were high-minded and aggressive, they seemed to have some pragmatics as well, which, I really wanted to work for a company that wasn't too ivory tower, but wanted to work for a company that was lean and mean and trying to do stuff for real people and real projects. I wasn't interested in research. Research was something that I had avoided till that point, and I just felt my personality type which tended to be a little impatient and a little emotional, was probably best in a product environment. Or I should say maybe even just better recognized in a product environment. So I felt it was just a better fit. I ended up being a little wrong with productivity products. The meeting them and then going to work for them ended up being different. So I don't know if I got an accurate picture. I don't know whether I was green and just so smitten with the idea, because the whole idea of making or evolving the C community to an object-oriented programming language was so desirable to me, because I had seen MAINSAIL take a more radical approach, and I saw it fail.
Right.
So, the idea of taking a radical approach, because I was really disappointed with what had happened at HP and MAINSAIL and Saracore. I mean, let's face it, moving cross country, I put a lot of my soul into that, and it really was a big disappointment. So I wanted the next opportunity to be less disappointing.
So part of it was the vision, the
vision and
right.
the pragmatics.
Together.
Right. Yeah, and I like both of them. Yeah.
So you joined PPI. It was still called PPI then in '85.
Yeah. I forget when the name was changed to Stepstone, but it was coincident with the venture capitalists coming in.
Right.
I forget when the venture capitalists and Tom Love parted ways, but they did, part ways.
Right.
And that was tough for me because Tom was a mentor of mine. And
so he was forced out?
that's
VCs?
my recollection. But I think Tom is better prepared to ever talk about the details. I spoke to Tom fairly recently, and I don't think he felt he was forced out, but it almost doesn't matter. The perception of the company was that the venture capitalists came in and forced Tom out. So, that's my perception of it. And it's just like some people perceived that Steve was ousted from Apple, and some people perceived he wasn't.
Right.
Some people perceived he was just sort of put into a place where he would then want to leave,
Right.
which could have been the same situation with Tom, for all I know. It could have been, okay, well, you can stay and do this,
Right.
and we know you won't be happy, so you leave. So it's the result is the same.
Interesting. Wait, so could you maybe describe how the company was before, when Tom was still there, and how big it was, what was the culture like, and then maybe talk about how things changed after the VCs came in.
To be honest, Tom was not around PPI a lot at the time. At least that's my recollection. He was always out trying to do deals. He was prolific in the number of companies he made contact with, and which is one of the reasons it was bad that he left, because he was really great. Like HP Labs, for instance, was a customer. I'm pretty sure Tom made that happen. So I don't think Tom had much influence on the culture of the company because he was always trying to do deals. He was very outbound. And which, to be honest, was disappointing to me, because here's a guy I admired. I almost wanted more interaction with him. So the other person I had interaction with was Brad, and he was closer to what I was working on. So it made sense that, he was around. But he was focused on other things. Like, he pretty much handed the language off to me and decided that he was going to go work on other stuff. So Brad and I ended up not having that much collaboration, because he trusted me with what I was doing, and he was interested in other stuff. So Brad and I too. So there was a void in the company with leadership / management, because the guy that all of software reported to, and I think all of software, just to quantify it, was probably 12 developers, fairly small. Maybe less, but my recollection is somewhere between 8 and 12. And sometimes we'd hire consultants temporarily to help out. So we had a manager of software who was actually the person who signed my offer letter, who went away soon after. And then they hired someone from ITT that they felt comfortable with, because a lot of the folks who founded PPI were ex-ITT folks. So they hired a fellow named Ken Hammer-Hodges, who was running software. And Ken, I think, had a technical background, but wasn't really driving software. So Brad was off in his ivory tower, Ken was the manager, Tom was off trying to get stuff done, and you had a guy like me trying to lead the future of the language, and then you had someone working on the interpreter, and someone working on, a few people working on IC packs. It was pretty scattered. It was not well managed. It was probably the least managed company of the 3 companies I had worked with to date. The first 2 were extremely well managed. Yeah.
So you mentioned Brad was doing other stuff. Was he working on the IC packs?
Yes.
The libraries?
He was working on IC packs. He was also, I believe, either before or after working on blocks. Oh. Now, he was doing blocks as a library component without language support.
Oh, I see.
Yes. Yeah. So, and that work wasn't really in any way being coordinated with development. And at the time, at least my recollection was Brad's door was usually shut and not really open. It was really distinct. It's almost like he was the research wing, him alone, and everyone else was development. Now, at some level, that's not necessarily bad, but there was a void. There was a because often you look to the sort of visionary founder for at least some direction. Right. But there were enough problems with the prototype implementation, the first and second iterations of Objective-C, that there was plenty of stuff for me to work on and identify. So my decision was to just put your head down. My first 6 months were spent porting it all over the place. And there was like no documentation on it whatsoever. So I documented the architecture and the implementation so that we could make decisions moving forward. And part of that was where I figured out, oh my God, some of this stuff is really flawed. So it, porting at some level, I felt like, oh my God, I was doing so much interesting work at Saracore with architecture and objects. And here I am porting this, preprocessor to all kinds of weird architectures and finding all kinds of problems. And it did feel a little bit like sweeping the floors, like I wasn't moving in a totally upward direction. But it didn't really matter to me because I believed that there was so much opportunity.
Well, let's get into the state of the language, when you started on it. I mean, so you've mentioned to me before that it was sort of you considered it kind of a prototype. Like, so what was the state of Objective-C and the compiler, if it even was a compiler or not?
Yeah, I mean,
when you came in,
Brad talks a little bit about this. I calling it a compiler was probably loose. It was more like some scripts that would key off certain things and then generate code. And
Generate C code or actually generate like
it would actually,
machine code?
it wouldn't even touch the C code. It would just try and touch the Objective-C parts and translate and expand them in line and leave the C code alone. Right?
Okay. So it would just translate the Objective-C into C, or
Exactly.
okay, right,
Along with the other C, so that a C compiler could accept it.
right. So then you would feed it to a full regular C compiler, and that would
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was just a translator.
It was a translator. Now, translator is a very general term. I mean, compiler people use that for lots of different things, but it was naive.
Right.
It wasn't full-bodied. It was not capable of detecting programming errors that are common, even a misspelling. Now, part of the reason it wasn't detecting errors was not only the technology, but the language definition. There was no explicit interface declaration whatsoever. So if you typed a message expression and sent an object a message of a certain name and typed it incorrectly, it would just assume that that was the name of the method. Yeah. Ouch. Well, especially when you consider the compile, debug, link, debug, that whole chain was slow in those days. So, yeah, it wasn't pretty. So we, after porting, and it was clear, two things were clear. We needed to evolve the language as minimally as possible from my perspective at the time for it to be reasonable. The goal wasn't, how do we make the greatest language? It's like, okay, we're in sort of a bad place right now, just from some very basic places, and that we need to add stuff that minimally enables the compiler to detect errors. And we need to write a compiler that's capable of processing the language in its entirety so that it's far less naive. And lastly, we need to make sure the code that's generated is robust, because they were trying to work with Make and other Unix tools. So just like Objective-C was a compromise from the beginning by saying we're embracing C. I mean, as soon as you say you're embracing C, you're compromising from a purity standpoint. With that in mind, they were also impure in the sense that they wanted to work with Unix tools like Make. They didn't want to have to build their own build system and so on. So you had to be sensitive to, if the compiler is going to be generating a file and Make detects that file but doesn't recompile the right things, and you produce an executable that doesn't work, that's really bad. And the compiler was doing that. The compiler was actually, along with the Make system, often you'd link a program and it would crash, and you'd find out, oh, wow, it's because our intermediate file isn't being managed properly, so that Make isn't recognizing that that file needs to be regenerated, and bad things would happen. So to me, it was a mess. So I wrote a proposal with a minimal set of things, along with an engineer named Alan Watt, who was, I believe, also an ITT engineer. And we wrote this paper, and part of the paper was, what are some of our other customers asking for? Like HP had developed a garbage collector, and they wanted us to integrate their garbage collector. So on one end of the spectrum, you had researchers who were asking for things. On the other end of the spectrum, you had a company like Next who was developing an operating system and a set of tools, and they were more sensitive to the type of problems I was just talking about. And, you know, I fought pretty hard for fixing the basics, which to me wasn't even, to me it was as obvious as, oh my God, recrafting this MAINSAIL program in C++ is heading in the wrong direction. It was as obvious as that. Yet I got pushback from the venture capitalists who were thinking in dollar signs, thinking, why should we pay you to recraft and add some of these things that will make it more robust? To them, error handling, they're money people. This notion of, well, we can't flag an error, to them, that's like, well, so what? They're not programmers, right? So, I was getting a little bit frustrated when I was basically being somewhat ignored. There was some appreciation, but this person, Ken, who was leading software, he didn't have the technical chops to, as the guy who was running software, to fight for me. Right. I had to fight myself. Right. So the great fortune was Next arranged a trip for two of their engineers, Stepstone, who was an OS guy, and Trey Madison, who was just out of Brown, really bright young guy. They both came to visit us in Sandy Hook and read my proposal and were just jazzed, totally jazzed. They're like, oh my God, this is exactly what we're bumping into. This solves our problems. And Steve Stone was a bass player, and he and I hit it off. There were lots of obscure groups that I was listening to at the time that Steve was totally plugged into. We went out to Greenwich Village, had a great time. And so it ended up being a really easy meeting because I sort of had it all laid out there for them. But I said, guys, when you go back to Palo Alto, I need you to write a letter that identifies what we talked about and why you are supportive of this. So I can basically do the political dance at Stepstone. And they wrote the letter, and I have the letter to this day. I think you've seen it. And after that, they had to let me work on this stuff. So that was how I got to add interfaces and fix some of the runtime problems that we've talked about before. I mean, I don't think, I just described some of them. An object module not being recompiled but creating a bug because of the poor language and compiler tools, that's clearly bad, right? So we in another interview have talked in gory detail about that, but it's probably not necessary for this context, right?
Yeah, it's probably.
Yeah.
Maybe just in a sentence or two.
Well, there used to be a global pool of selectors, which are the names that's used by Objective-C. That global pool was contributed to by the object modules. The linker would basically coalesce things. And if the table that was in the object modules was not up to date, then when it got copied to the global pool would be corrupt. And the program wouldn't run. So simply put, it was a good prototype. It was a toy in the early days. My job was to try and build it into a tool that had more wins than drawbacks. And yeah, the letter worked. I got the freedom to recraft the compiler from the ground up and solve all these problems. And even on the machines of the day, which were typically running 4 megabytes, the performance of it was not that bad. And the performance of launch time and the more dynamic runtime I added was work that we did throughout many, many years. And at the time, some of the resistance I got, not only from the venture capital people, but the engineers, was, can we really do dynamic relocation of some of these big data tables? And I said, it's a dynamic language. It has to be implemented dynamically. Right. You don't implement a dynamic language statically. Mm-hmm. You just don't. Sure, there are some static elements. I'm not saying it needs to be, all class descriptors need to be consed up on the fly. You can imagine that. The class descriptors were laid out by the compiler and coalesced by the linker. Even that could be dynamic. You could read a text file with all the attributes in it and actually generate the data structures on the fly. So it was a really delicate dance between what does the compiler and linker do and what does the runtime do. But because I had worked in a rich runtime like MAINSAIL and they were always trying to understand that delicate balance, I had some relevant experience not as a compiler writer but as a language user, which also includes metadata. The original metadata that was in Objective-C was incomplete, so I had proposed making sure the metadata, which is the data that describes the classes and the instances and the methods and so on, that be much more robust. And that also was something that evolved over time. Yeah. So.
Earlier you mentioned porting the language to various places. What sorts of platforms were you porting to?
Oh man, well, HPUX, Apollo. The most obscure machine I ported to was a Gould, which was like an IBM clone mini computer. It was really weird because I had to generate. I don't remember the exact details, but it was something like the assembly language was accepting VAX mnemonics, but they were then being translated to IBM instructions. And I was like, wow, that is so weird. It's because whoever wrote the assembler at the time didn't took the code from somewhere else and just hacked it and stuff like that. But yeah, the Gould port was really weird. There wasn't really much assembly. That was another requirement when I would dive into this is how do we, there's various ways to implement message dispatch. The way that they originally implemented it required some assembly language because you'd call a function, let's say message send, and you're in the message send routine, but that message send has arguments that need to be passed to the eventual object. You have to leave those on the stack frame. So the notion of you need a way to jump to that, which is really only done in assembly language, at least when you put the message send arguments and the user arguments on the same stack frame, which is what we were doing for efficiency. Another way to implement messaging is to have the message dispatcher or the message lookup routine return a pointer to the target and then call it again. So you have two function calls. So it's a classic difference of speed versus elegance, right? One was easy to port, slower, two function calls. One is one function call, requires some assembly hack, but it's faster. And obviously when you don't care about portability and you're developing an operating system like we were at Next and Apple, you just do whatever's the absolute fastest on your processor and operating system. But Stepstone was we don't own an operating system or processor, so there are various techniques. And often what I would promote is let's get the port up and running with the slow mechanism, and if we sell enough of these, we can go and do the assembly work to make it faster.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. So for what you mentioned, some of the Next and HP. What were some of the other customers that you were doing these ports for? And how did you get these customers?
I think Tom at the time originally, and how do we get the other customers? I mean, they were advertising in Byte. Actually found one of the old ads and copied it for you. They advertised in Byte. I mean, Byte was really well read. So I think a lot of people contacted them, and hopefully we had a port they had. If not, they'd offer. That's the other problem with a small company is, what if someone calls you and says, I need one for this processor, and it's one sale, right? Well, in a desperate company, you allocate resources to develop that port for that one sale. In a non-desperate company, you think, well, let's at least have some critical mass of clients for that machine. For example, I can't imagine they sold that many Gould translators. All that business stuff, Hansen, was out of my hands. All I know is they asked for some of these ports. So I don't really know how they got the customers. I actually never interacted with that many customers. We were pretty sheltered. And even the next interaction, I felt like that was fostered by me, given my position that I've described I was in. They did not really want developers to talk much to customers or to see what was going on there, which I don't think is that unusual necessarily. Yeah.
But how did both HP and Next become customers? Was that through Tom as well, or how did they first become customers?
HP, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it's as simple as, I know it was HP Labs, so it was not on the mainstream of HP's product cycle. So I think it's pretty common for researchers to buy tools, try them out, especially people who had if you're a researcher and you've inherited a big C base of code, hey, look, I just saw this advertisement for Objective-C. It gives me some Smalltalk with C. So I think a lot of it was pretty casual and organic. I don't think anyone went out and it became a bigger deal when we were trying to sell the IC packs, because then you're selling an architecture, a set of components, and issues like source code. Do people get source code? That's a bigger issue. People usually don't like being in the language business, but when they start using actual software, they become a little bit more antsy about making sure they get source, and then it's a bigger rat hole, which Richard Stallman has the answer to, but not everyone was willing to give away their source code. But let me make sure I answered the question.
Just sort of how did Next first become a customer?
So I wasn't there, obviously. I was at Stepstone, but I'm told that William Parkhurst, who was the original AppKit developer, was smitten with it. I guess he, maybe like I went to OOPSLA. I don't know that William was at OOPSLA, but I think he may have been. And he was looking for tools and came across Objective-C and figured they'd give it a shot. I think they were also considering Object Pascal or Pascal. I'm not sure Object Pascal existed, but I do believe they were considering some of that. I think there was also I've heard from some Next folk that there was some discussion about using display PostScript directly because Bud Tribble thought the overhead of Objective-C might be too great. Bud was running software at the time and ran, the Mac project. He was one of the very early Next leaders. But they decided to do quite a bit with Objective-C and hit these walls. And also hit compile time walls. There were lots of issues after they had spent, I think, 6 to 9 months with the language, roughly. Wow. And that's when they basically contacted Stepstone to read them the Riot Act and say, we've made a big decision to go with your language, and we need it to be pushed in this direction, or else we might reconsider. Right. And it really was born out of good politics. I mean, the politics were valid. It wasn't arbitrary. It was bottom up. It wasn't like Bud, was driving this. The engineers were driving it, and probably really making William, unhappy. I mean, the engineers at Next were like, William, what'd you do to us, right? I don't know that. Never. William and I, correspond occasionally. Guess I could have asked him or should have asked him, but I could just imagine, based on when I ended up doing some consulting for them as a Stepstone employee and later hiring on, I knew they were in pain. They were in pain. So, but let's face it, C was at the core of Mach and their, operating system decision, and it was really the only path for them was to just make this work. And that's something that I sensed big time after talking with them. And then it was so clear that this was a major obstacle that needed to be solved. And it's funny, the venture capital people, I don't know whether it's an East Coast, West Coast thing, but their respect for Steve and what Next was doing, it's almost like, oh, well, why is Next more important than HP Labs? And to me, it was like so obvious. Well, how could you even question that? HP Labs is piddling around with the language, and Next is building an operating system. This is like our chance. It didn't seem like they got it. Right. And again, it could be East Coast, West Coast, because to them, oh, well, yeah, sure, Steve Jobs founded Apple, but yeah, that was what it was, and so he's starting a company, like, so what? Right. To them, it felt like, so what? And I didn't grow up with Apple. I was not a Mac person. I was weaned on first, as we talked, mainframes, then minis, then workstations. The reason Next excited me was, wow, a workstation that mere mortals could use was really exciting. But like PCs and Macs, to me, were toys for what I was working on.
So the VC saw like HP Labs. That's like, that's a big name.
Big name. Exactly.
And this next startup is, who knows whether that's going anywhere. They didn't think that was
right.
going to be a big deal.
Right. Yeah, there's a great video that I'm probably going to mention later if we get a chance by Malcolm Gladwell. It's a 20-minute Google presentation where he talks about elite institution cognitive disorder. Have you ever seen that video?
No.
Oh my God, it's brilliant. And I think Stepstone had elite institution cognitive disorder. I think from their perspective, HP was an elite institution, and it was. Right. HP back then was, they were so respected. Things have changed, right. Yeah. But yeah, to them, Next was just a startup company, just like us. We're a startup, they're a startup. So, actually, the Malcolm Gladwell talk is more what he's talking about there is how people get so smitten with elite academic institutions, and often will mortgage the house and everything else to go to one of these big name schools. They go to the big name school, and especially in STEM, and they fail. And they fail not because they're not smart people, because if you get into, Yale or Harvard or any of these really big schools, you're obviously a smart person. Right. But they fail because they end up in STEM or computer science, or name your tough, undergrad degree. They end up being in the bottom third right. of the class, and that's never happened to them before. Right. And they're convinced they're a failure. Mm-hmm. And he backs it up with data. And he tells an interesting story because he too didn't go to an elite institution. And he even makes fun that one of the reasons he agreed to give this Google talk, which was for free, usually he gets paid, was that it's for Google. right? He's like really smitten with Google, and he even said, it's not about even hanging out with really smart people. I know plenty of smart people. It's a great talk.
I'll check
Great
it out. I guess before we move on to next, let's finish off the Stepstone story. So you mentioned the VCs came in and then sort of the company changed. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, it's a little bit hard for me to quantify since the culture at Stepstone was already not wildly good. I sort of described that before. In other words, we lacked real leadership. Brad was off doing some research. The management was from IT&T. It wasn't a hungry entrepreneurial startup like the other two I had been a part of. So when you take that lack of focus and lack of hunger and you bring in money people who think they know better than the engineers, it's just not a good feeling to be part of an organization like that, because engineers, along with the customers of the technology, should be driving the technology. They need to be sensitive to deadlines. They need to be sensitive to, well, if we do that, we only have one customer for it. There's that type of management of priorities that wasn't happening. And we had a small staff, and we were doing too much, broadly. And so the venture capitalists, because they want to make more money, they view more as better, right? So let's do more IC packs. They didn't understand that even the IC packs we were doing were half-baked. They didn't understand, and something I learned, I didn't know this at the time, but now looking back, and I learned it soon after Stepstone, actually at Next, and I've never gone back, is you cannot develop a domain-specific IC pack or kit, whatever you want to call it, or objectware. There's been many of these terms for grandiose libraries that solve domain problems. You cannot do one of those without doing an app to prove it. And I would argue 2 apps at least. Because if you do a kit and do an app, well, that says, okay, that kit's good enough to service that app. Let's say it's a spreadsheet. But then if you say, now you want to do a schematic capture package, wildly different, would that graphics model support that application as well? So they didn't understand this. And I was pretty green at the time. And I'm not saying I understood it either. But if they were well managed and they had the right people at the helm of the company, they should have someone should have understood it. Brad didn't understand it. I mean, Brad just thinks, I haven't talked to Brad recently, but I saw the interview you did with Brad a couple years ago. Brad just thinks IC packs were, ahead of their time, or you can't sell them, or it's destined to failure. Almost like, well, we tried and, there wasn't a business model. Well, you could blame the business model all you want. The technology just wasn't good enough. And there are business model issues. I'm not suggesting there aren't. There's lots of issues. But fundamentally, if you're talking about a company like Next who's doing professional stuff, or Adobe that's doing professional stuff, or Lotus, the guys who are doing pro apps, they're not going to base their future on your objects and where you have no apps, especially when you're not giving away the source code. So it's they didn't understand this. The venture capitalists, they just wanted more IC packs. They really didn't want to support the whole idea of working on interactive development environments, better compilers, browsers, because let's face it, one of the great things about Smalltalk was it had a great browsing environment. And that's something I worked on at Next later on, but when I was talking about that at Stepstone, I was, well, we're not going to do that. So their focus was almost entirely on IC packs, which is also what Brad's book was about. The revolution. Hey, we're going to develop, and it's actually interesting. There's a talk I found a few weeks ago called "Object-Oriented Programming is Bad." Okay. When I first saw it, I was like, oh my God, this must be really weird. But it had 500,000 views. And so I said, I have to watch this if it has 500,000 views. And the guy who did it is really pretty thoughtful. And it's an interesting piece. I don't agree with all of it. He absolutely is down on encapsulation, absolutely thinks that it will lead you to the wrong place. I don't agree with that. I think you can use it effectively. But one of the things he talks about is how he always felt when programming with objects that it's like designing a house with lots of walls before you really know what you're using the house for or the building for. That struck a chord with me. And I think to some degree it relates to this discussion where Stepstone was making these plans and architectures, and other companies were guilty of it too, Taligent in the future, where they're building all this stuff, but they really don't know what's going to be sitting above them. Right. And it's almost too soon to hardwire the architecture.
So they're building tools, but they haven't talked to who's using the tools. So they're building it without an idea in mind for how they should be building these components.
Right. I mean, even something as simple as a hash table or a lookup routine, you can build obviously a hash table object without writing an app. However, the different apps will or will not work well with that hash function or hash table. So by using that hash table in many different scenarios, you will parameterize it differently, you will build it differently. Even the hash table for message sending, which we may talk about a little bit later, I went with the simplest thing on the planet, linear probing with a particular hash code that was computed from the selectors. And Bertrand and I and others in the early days, we played around with lots of different schemes. And the simplest thing is what worked the best for Objective-C. It's not intuitive, some of this stuff. You have to build lots of different things and measure them. And there's a lot of work involved in that type of craftsmanship, which clearly wasn't happening at Stepstone. It was purely, listen, we need this, we need that, and there, unlike and it's interesting, like the open source movement, one of the things that's wonderful about it is people will get it and there'll be more of this loop and collaboration. That's the other thing that wasn't happening that much. Like when HP contacted Stepstone to politic for taking their collector, they literally wanted to just give us the collector without any iteration with other customers. There's another perfect example. If we integrated their collector, yes, it might have made them happy, but I can guarantee you would not have worked for Next. And so I felt like, just to tie this up, I felt like, the first two startups I worked for were professional companies with professional people, and I was treated professionally. And at Stepstone, though I really love Tom and like Brad, the company was dysfunctional. And the fact that they didn't make it is not surprising to me at all. It's not about the concepts. They had the right concepts. They didn't execute the business. They didn't execute on the technology, and that was their problem. And that's why it was interesting when I was listening to Brad's interview with you. It's a little bit animated and like, no, Brad, it's, there's other things. But Brad's a brilliant guy, and Brad just there were so many business things you asked him that he really couldn't answer. So he was divorced from that as well. But in a startup company with very few people, the principals need to have strong opinions, or else other people will come in and ravage. And that's what happened.
So before the break, I guess I just wanted to ask sort of one last question about, was not Stepstone in particular, but we mentioned the idea of objectware, which I guess came from Brad Cox's vision of software components as being a revolutionizing force in the software industry. And I think your take on that was that it was not necessarily the vision itself that was the issue, it was the execution. But I was sort of curious about your take on the whole idea of selling objects on the open market and the potential impact that that might have, since that was clearly Brad's vision. It was maybe part of that vision was what motivated you to join Stepstone in the first place. I don't know if that's true or not, but maybe just talk about what your view of that
At an
vision
abstract
was.
level, it was definitely part of it. I, at the time, wasn't a real deep thinker in that area, but as far as the sales pitch goes, I was partly sold and just skeptical. And I think I didn't really put any meat on the bones while I was at Stepstone because I had my hands full with trying to save the compiler and language. If the compiler and language were in a better spot, I probably would have been more intrigued with Stepstone's decision-making in the ICPAC area. But it was almost like it was going on as a separate thread within the company that I just didn't pay much attention to. And in fact, not only did I have my hands full, but the culture of the company encouraged people on different threads not to communicate, which wasn't the culture at other companies, but it really was the culture there. In other words, I had some ideas on the interpreter, and I was really never encouraged to participate in interpreter plans, which clearly the language changes I was proposing did affect the interpreter because it was yet another implementation of the language. It was just more interactive. So, but the interpreter was also a half-baked. When you hear Brad talk about the company, he doesn't really talk much about the interpreter. And if I recall, a lot of that may have even been inherited from another company that they were working with. And then, so it was just a hodgepodge of stuff. And I, as we previously talked, looking back, I know very clearly, and I don't need to be pedantic about it unless you want me to clarify something, but I just think it was the execution. I also think I said this before, with components, shipping software becomes pretty important because ultimately, if they're non-trivial components, companies don't want to put their future in another company's hands without control of the source code. Right. Which is true for other stuff too, but it's particularly true for components.
Right. And I mean, in some ways, it seems almost as if Brad's model of selling objects, I guess you could modify to include the source, but his model was that it would be completely black box and you wouldn't get the source, so you were stuck if there were problems with it.
Exactly. And if Stepstone was more active in app development, they would have had more combat experience with those realities. So I think they were just naive. I think it was naive. And I don't know why it was naive, but sometimes people just have to experience things and move on. There was just never any thoughtful, I don't remember any like company meeting where there was any thoughtful discussion on, can people speak up on why we're not succeeding as a company? It was almost like the engineers were pawns, the engineers were doing their thing, and higher level people were trying to figure out how to make this a business. Whereas at Next, which we're going to talk about soon, Steve Jobs, especially this size company, Steve Jobs would have called everyone into the room and say, well, how come this isn't working or that isn't working? Let's hash it out. That's how a functional company works. They put the cards on the table and figure out what's working and what isn't working. And that exercise never, to my knowledge, at least if it happened, it didn't include me. Or Brad, apparently. So, again, when people come in writing checks for a small company, beware. Beware.
Well, that's a good segue to the next story. We've already talked a little bit about how Objective-C came to be used at Next. You mentioned William Parkhurst and Bud's original ideas about what the software should be. Is there any more you want to add to that story?
Regarding before I arrived at Next?
Yeah, I guess, the decision that led to using Objective-C.
I think to some degree it was also born out of C being the base language, them wanting, it seeming very desirable to have a dynamic message passing idiom on top of the C language, and certainly it being based on Smalltalk, which has the Park, heritage. There was also sort of this cultural nice match with Park and Smalltalk and dynamism, and making a small runtime that would fit on a 4 megabyte 68K, that type of stuff. But they too were a little naive and being sold a bill of goods that they didn't know up front where the bodies were buried. They just didn't know. So they decided to use it, and they then worked hard to make sure the problems were fixed. And even Steve was very vocal with Tom Love, so sort of CEO to CEO, about, we took a bet on you guys. And because before I actually got hired by Next, I was out there doing some consulting where I was delivering a more advanced version of the translator that did better with errors, that generated better code. I was working in Next's business office on Deer Creek that was segregated from the engineering because it was very secretive. I wasn't allowed to see the cube or anything. I had no idea what they were doing. They had a Sun workstation set to the side where I was working with the Sun C compiler and the Objective-C translator to demonstrate the work I had done. So when I was out there demonstrating this work to their engineers, Steve Jobs had shown up in the entryway of the main office and had a talk with myself, Bud Tribble, Steve Stone, who was the other engineer at Next, who was my liaison, and Tom Love. And Steve had pretty much read Tom the Riot Act in terms of, we made a bet on you guys and you're not delivering. And, Steve is doing great stuff, but we need your whole company to be engaged and support Steve, because we care about the language, we care about the infrastructure, we care about the runtime, the error messages. And he went through, he sounded like an engineer. It was amazing. he was parroting what his engineers were saying and spinning it a certain way, but ultimately told Tom that invest more in the language infrastructure and less in the IC packs. And, Tom listened and was respectful, and Bud was very quiet. Bud's a very quiet person in general. He didn't say much. And I was sort of just smiling, saying, here's a CEO which has a clue. My goodness, what a difference from the venture capitalist now running Stepstone. This is a guy I could see working for. So I was just jazzed that here's someone who understands you have to make the language work before you start building on top of it, which, at the end of the day, as Steve loved to say, isn't rocket science, right? It's really basic engineering. And so that was the point in time when I think Steve probably told Bud and Steve Stone, asked Steve Naroff to come in for an interview. I don't want to deal with this company. Who knows? They probably talked about buying the company too, but Steve is well known for targeted hiring practices. Let's just say, call it that. It's a lot easier than buying a company, right? Especially since he doesn't care about a lot of the other stuff, especially the IC packs. Right. So, yeah.
So then, talk about how the process was like, sort of joining Next and leaving Stepstone.
Well, when I gave, first, I guess it's interesting to talk about the interview. I flew out for the interview, and I actually have the interview list here. Let me see where it is. Yeah. So I had a bunch of group interviews. Like I had William Parkhurst, Kevin Enderby, Joe Caprioletti, who interviewed me in the morning, and then a 45-minute interview with just Steve.
Wow.
Okay. And then lunch with the OS group, and then a bunch of group interviews with Avi Tavanian, Peter King, Mike Damone, Bud Tribble, like the whole cast of characters, but all like long group interviews. And when Steve came into the room, Kevin Enderby, who was a compiler linker guy, was held over. We were babbling about something. Kevin, respected that it was Steve's time and said, well, Steve, I'll let you get to it. And Steve's like, oh, no, Kevin, you could stay, So Kevin begrudgingly stayed for a while Steve proceeded to confront me. And it's funny, Kevin probably remembers this better than I do, because whenever I see Kevin, he loves to mention this. Like, oh man, that was tough sitting through that. But Steve basically looked at my resume with some disdain, questioning my career, what I had done. And it was interesting. I proceeded to defend my life and, talk about the work I had done and talk about the two startups I was a part of and how I wound up at Stepstone, a company he didn't respect, right? So I went through that and I saw Steve immediately sort of relax. And I don't think I was smart enough at the time to truly know what was going on, but it didn't take long to figure it out afterwards. I mean, Steve was convinced I should be at the company before he entered the room. Yet he made it a tough interview. And he did it because he knew I had leadership potential at the company, and he wanted to see whether I would shrivel up and die under his questioning. He wanted to see, can this guy defend himself? Can this guy defend his ideas? Or is he going to shrivel up and die? And again, given my background, New York, played in many bands, and had to deal with a wide array of people, I just sort of had fun telling them about all the stuff I had done. And when I got around to telling him how I thought programming was an art and how it related to music and how all that brought me to this place, he was sold. And because he really does had an inner affinity for people that loved music. He loved music. And I know that he felt programming was an art, and so I think we developed a kinship in that meeting that catapulted me to great places from that point on. I forget when I think Kevin stayed for like 15 minutes, and Steve and I held over a little bit. And then the rest of the day we had a great lunch interview with the OS team at Little Garden, which was in the day just the coolest Silicon Valley. It was a Chinese restaurant in Palo Alto that was like a who's who, lots of great Sun engineers as Sun was coming up and next. And just listening to the conversations at all the tables was very amusing. It was just a very incestuous place to be. But so that was my recollection of the interview. And so when I went back, they made me an offer, and I told Stepstone, and they threatened to sue me. They did not want to bless me leaving them and going to work for Steve at Next. And so I told Steve and Next, listen, this is like crazy stuff. I've never, I was 25, 26. And I, 27. But I never been threatened with a lawsuit. I didn't have the means to defend myself. And the whole notion of them taking a lien on my modest condo that I bought with 14% mortgage was intimidating. So I said, Steve, listen, they're threatening me, and you need to solve this for me, or I can't come. And he told Gary Moore, his lawyer, to deal with it. Gary dealt with it within, a few days. And it all made sense, though, because Next had bought a full source license, okay? So they had the source code. And I wasn't going to be taking any ICPAC code with me. I didn't work on that. There was no intellectual property issues regarding that. So as far as the language goes, since they bought the source code, we were really free to, and we were going to develop our own runtime. We weren't even going to use their runtime. And so that problem got solved pretty quickly. And I think things have changed over the years. People realize companies don't own employees, and that if they didn't have a source code license and I took source code out of the building, yes, that's not cool. But I'm allowed to take my knowledge of the language with me because they were working on the language. And in fact, if Stepstone was smart, and Dennis Sisko, who was running the place at the time, really stepped back, he'd say, great, we don't want to invest in the language. Let Next drive the language, and we'll drive our ICPAC strategy. So it's just, people were frantic because they were having a problem running their company. There was no really grounded thinking. And if I would have told Dennis what I just told you, he would have probably looked at me like, you're 27 and poor, and I'm old and rich, so why are you trying to tell me what to do? Stupid stuff like that. And that's what was also beautiful about Steve is how much money you had or how old you were. None of that entered into his thinking. It's what are your ideas, right? And so I think So the transition was, after that scare, all went pretty well. We don't get too much into personal stuff in an interview like this, but one of the personal issues that affected my wife even more than me, but was still a family thing, was as we were making the plans with moving to Sunnyvale, and taking the job, was my wife was pregnant. And we got a call from the doctor, like right before we're about to move out, that he saw something on the sonogram and the pregnancy was not going in the right direction. And we lost that baby. A traumatic event, considering you're switching jobs. There's been so much moving, and that happens. And it really was tough. So, but we got through it, and then I went into this pressure cooker situation where I'm at next. I start learning about the hardware and the strategy, and the fact that I think I started in August, and
Of what year?
88.
88.
The interview was in May. Then maybe I started, I don't know how many months, but some number of months passed. Close enough. I think it was August that I started there, because cross-country moves and the pregnancy issue and stuff. But we had the introduction of the cube in October 12th, I think, of 88. So we were in the bomb run, but that was a big next term. I think Bud coined it, but who knows? But it's always like you're in the bomb run for the release. So here I'm new, don't have a product yet, so many pieces on the floor. It was a tumultuous time, but an really exciting time, because we were, next was the talk of the town then. It's actually interesting that this is October 8th. So Steve passed last week in 2011, and the intro was the end of this week. So it's interesting that this is happening between those two pretty big events in my life, at least. But let's see.
Yeah. So what was your first position, and what did you work on when you first got there?
So I was an engineer who worked for a fellow named Mike Damoni, who was in the operating system group. Okay, Avi Tavanian had hired on a couple months before me. We're very close. He was on the interview schedule, but he was pretty new. He was not running anything. He was Mr. Mock and was doing OS work. So I was reporting to Mike Damoni, who was the manager for the OS group, and it was a big open room with, I was thrown in with the OS group. So there was no tools group. Stepstone, who was basically hacking the compiler prior to hiring me, was trained as an OS guy, but was just a jack of all trades. And he loved it and was driving this hire because he was just dying to get out of the compiler business, right? and his clients throughout Next Software were also dying for him to get out of the compiler business, because they had lots of bugs that were on their lists. And, Steve was an OS guy, and he had lots of stuff going on, helping out with the OS and stuff. Doing compiler work in your spare time when you aren't a compiler guy and trying to help people, it's tough. So I was, the very first thing was just fixing bugs in the Stepstone translator that I had done as a Stepstone employee, and making sure the integration with, at the time, the GNU compiler. See, that was totally new to me. I had no idea that they were using Richard Stallman's Free Software Foundation product, which was also very new. the 1.0 of GCC happened in 1987, and this was 88. So it was a year out of the chute, out of the 1.0 release, and there were bugs in it too. So bugs in the Stepstone translator, bugs in the early versions of GCC, and that was, I'd say, at least 2 to 4 weeks of my first month there. And it's interesting, like after 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of bug fixing and concentrated helping everyone, I know the person who was working on the workspace, the Finder at the time, Chris Franklin. I remember like sending me a fairly public email that was copied to most of software saying like how much he thanked me for helping fix these bugs and how it's really helping their productivity. And, you know, it was such an open environment that simple things like making sure the compiler worked was like I was a rock star just because they were getting stuff done that they couldn't get done before. And that was great. It made me feel, it motivated me, right? I felt like I was needed. I went from an environment where I was begrudgingly let loose or to do anything interesting to an environment where just fixing bugs made people like giddy. It was, so, I mean, honestly, really soon after that, they raised my salary and treated me really well because they just were happy. And I think we've talked offline. Next had an open salary and stock structure where people, when they were happy with other people or not happy, some people, it really wasn't referenced often, I don't think. But in this case, I think Chris or others went and saw what I was being paid in my stock position. And I mean, very soon after, because it was an open salary structure, my clients lobbied for me to get a bump. And that was also like unheard of. I had never experienced anything like that. It was honestly the best environment and culture I had ever experienced, you know? So this just led to me being even that more devoted to doing crazy great things. I'm like, wow, it's being recognized. And so I credit, you know, a lot of the cool stuff I did over the years with providing an environment that was nurturing and appreciative of things, which is surprisingly hard to find. I think in any field. I was really lucky, really fortunate. So other than that, then we had to draw up plans for what is next. When are we going to not be dependent on their runtime? So I started working on a replacement runtime that was optimized for Mach and optimized for their, and I had the only two people working on compilers then was me and Kevin Enderby. He worked on assemblers, linkers, loaders, and I worked on the front end and the middle and the integration with GCC. And so I had ideas for what the linker could do for me to make Objective-C better. And Mach-O had very interesting features for organizing data, organizing the metadata. And we developed really interesting system-specific, Mach-specific ways to optimize the metadata so that paging was minimized and that all the stuff was organized and accessible really easily. So that was fun, and Kevin did a lot of that work. And just more and more, owning a linker for a language like Objective-C is really important because even though it's a dynamic language and you could just defer to runtime for so much, because we were running on modest machines with modest memory, devising creative ways to distribute the workload, get the compiler and linker to do as much as possible, and deferring as little as possible to runtime was really important. And it took a fair amount of work to do that well. So we weren't doing that much with evolving the language. We were evolving the implementation. Now, one notable exception, which happened fairly early on, was categories. Jean-Marie Hulot, who was working on Interface Builder, again, not in any formal team, but just another part of the software group, he had come to me and talked to me about what magic he was doing to make Interface Builder work. And he was using something called POSAS, which was a runtime hack to basically take a class and interject another class ahead of it in the metadata so that you could basically spoof the runtime into executing code. And while that was cool, I decided that it needed linguistic support to support Interface Builder, because Interface Builder was really the crown jewel. And making sure it didn't depend on hacks, but depended on language features explicitly is sort of important. So we developed categories for that.